Well, a really important thing, in order to accelerate the growth of your startup, you really do need to access capital. I suppose in the first instance, money will come from friends and family, but then you really do need to think about other alternatives. So what we'd say is, number one, working capital management may sound a little bit boring, but really very important. Important to understand VAT, for example. So when do you have to pay the taxman its VAT? And ideally, you'd like to be paid by your customers first. So smart working capital management can be critical. Other areas that you should look at are the banks. Don't dispel the banks completely, but it is important. They do provide a useful sort of financing, particularly for example, companies that have revenue. It may be possible to actually get some sort of asset-backed financing from the banks. Another area, obviously, to look at and to talk to, another source of finance, is to talk to Enterprise Ireland. Enterprise Ireland offer a wide range of financing and funding options to companies, from grant aid, initial grant aid or feasibility grants, right through to equity that they may provide to high potential startups, which is particularly relevant and particularly important for ambitious technology companies. And other sources that I would look at is, I talk to the venture capitalists. I mean, there's never been a healthier supply of venture capital in this country, provided by both the domestic venture capitalists, but also a number of international investors who have entered the Irish market, either directly or in partnership with Irish venture capital firms, or more recently through the Innovation Fund. Now, there are a lot of sources of capital, and that's what can often be confusing for companies. And so what it is important is that you consider your various different sources of capital, you get advice and you take advice. And it's not just, capital is money, but smart capital is access to the right people. You want to be doing business and accessing capital from people who can help your business. So whether it's a venture capital provider with particular interest and expertise in your area, whether it's a strategic investor who can actually introduce you to customers or to clients, it's really very important that you take advice and decide that whomever you are going to take capital from or engage with, they can actually assist your business and provide smart capital to your business. It's important for tech startups and for growing any business that you're compliant and that you look after your tax affairs. But tax isn't all mundane. It is important that you access all of the various tax incentives that are out there for you, and there are many. For example, if you were a company only starting up in 2009 or later, you might be able to access a corporation tax relief, which essentially means if you're fortunate enough to be in the position to be making profit, you can make up to €320,000 worth of profit each year for your first 3 years without having to pay tax. That's very important. That's one important key incentive that's there. Another important incentive is obviously the R&D tax credit that is on offer to companies. And it is really very suited to companies operating in the high technology area. So I would expect all high-tech companies who are performing R&D activity to be accessing the R&D tax credit. Now, there have been a couple of changes that were made to that in 2012, which actually make it easier for companies to access that credit early on their first €100,000 worth of spend. And very importantly, the R&D tax credit has now, a new relief has now been introduced to incentivise individuals involved in the R&D process. And essentially, since this year, companies can pass some of the benefit of the R&D tax credit onto individuals, key individuals involved in the R&D process. And that's an important incentive that's there. Another tax-based incentive that exists for companies and is very suitable for companies operating in the high-tech area is the new EII scheme. So that's essentially, people will be familiar with the old BES scheme. That's been replaced with something called the Employment and Investment Incentive, or for short, EII scheme. And essentially that allows companies to raise up to €10 million worth of finance through the EII scheme, which is really very competitive. And what's very important actually is, with the new EII scheme, it's available to a much broader range of companies than the old BES. So that's something that I'd be encouraging companies to look at. And also for employees or startup entrepreneurs who might have been employed in a job before, they should also consider the seed capital relief, which essentially goes hand in hand with this EII relief, where employees, if they leave a job and set up a new venture, could be entitled to secure back tax that they've paid over the last 6 years and use that as the seed capital towards their new venture.